He bandaged a stranger's arm and was gifted horses by tribes. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty trail as Thomas Callahan urged his tired horse forward. Summer in the Montana Territory, 1876, was unforgiving, and the heat had been relentless for days. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow, his weathered hand leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead. At 32, he had the worn appearance of a man who had seen more than his share of hardship. 3 years after the financial panic of '73 had cost him his small mercantile business in St. Louis, Thomas was still trying to find his footing in this harsh new territory. The promise of land and opportunity had drawn him west, but so far, the territory had offered little but struggle. As he rounded a bend in the trail, Thomas spotted a figure slumped against a large boulder. His first instinct was caution. Lone travelers in these parts could mean trouble. But as he drew closer, he could see it was a Native American man, clutching his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. Thomas reined in his horse, hesitating. Relations between settlers and the tribes were tense, especially with rumors of conflict brewing after Custer's recent movements in the territory. Most travelers would have ridden on, not wanting to get involved. "You need help there?" Thomas called, keeping a safe distance. The man looked up, pain evident in his eyes. He was perhaps in his 40s, wearing traditional Crow clothing, though Thomas wasn't entirely certain of his tribal affiliation. The man nodded once, his expression guarded but desperate. Thomas dismounted slowly. He was no doctor, but he'd learned basic medical care during his brief service in the Union Army. "I'm going to come closer," he said, speaking clearly and holding his hands where they could be seen. "I have supplies that might help." The wounded man watched warily as Thomas approached and knelt beside him. A deep gash ran from his elbow to mid-forearm, the kind made by a sharp blade. Thomas didn't ask how it happened. That wasn't his business. "My name's Thomas," he said, reaching slowly for his saddlebag. "I need to clean this before I wrap it." The man nodded again. "White Hawk," he replied in accented but clear English. "Crow." Thomas worked methodically, first cleaning the wound with water and a small amount of whiskey from his flask, then applying a poultice of yarrow he kept for such purposes. White Hawk remained stoic despite what must have been considerable pain. "You know medicine?" White Hawk asked as Thomas began wrapping the arm with strips of clean cloth. "Just what I've picked up along the way," Thomas replied. "My mother taught me about plants for healing. The Army taught me about wounds." When he finished, Thomas offered White Hawk some jerky and the rest of his water. They sat in silence as the sun began to set, painting the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Where you headed?" Thomas finally asked. "My people are camped 3 days north," White Hawk replied. "I was returning from a trading journey when I was attacked by 2 men who wanted my horses. I fought them off, but they took my horses when I was injured." Thomas nodded, understanding the severity of White Hawk's situation. Without horses, the journey would be arduous, perhaps impossible in his condition. "I'm heading to Helena," Thomas said, "but I can take you part of the way to your people first." White Hawk studied Thomas for a long moment before responding. "Why would you help me further, stranger?" Thomas considered the question. There were practical reasons. Traveling together could be safer, but the truth was simpler. "Because it's what anyone should do," he said finally. "And out here, we all need help sometimes." White Hawk nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, we will go north together." As they prepared a small camp for the night, Thomas couldn't know that this chance encounter would change the course of his life in the territory, leading him into a world he had glimpsed only from a distance, and testing his character in ways he could not imagine. Dawn broke with a chill that belied the heat to come. Thomas and White Hawk broke camp early, sharing a meager breakfast of hardtack and coffee. Thomas's horse, a sturdy brown gelding named Buck, would have to carry them both, at least for stretches of the journey. "We'll need to go slow," Thomas explained as he helped White Hawk mount behind him. "Buck's strong, but he can't carry us both all day in this heat." White Hawk nodded. "There's a creek half a day's ride from here. We can rest there." As they rode, Thomas learned that White Hawk was not merely a member of the Crow tribe, but a respected leader among his band. He had been returning from a diplomatic mission to other Crow groups when he was ambushed. "These are difficult times for my people," White Hawk explained as they alternated between riding and walking to spare the horse. The government makes promises, then breaks them. They want us on reservations, away from our hunting grounds. Thomas had heard stories about the government's dealings with the tribes, but had never given them much thought. Like most settlers, he'd been focused on his own survival. The horses they took from you, Thomas asked, were they valuable? White Hawk's expression darkened. They were more than valuable. One was a painted stallion from my father's line, raised by my hands since he was a foal. The other, a mare from the Nez Perce tribes of the spotted kind they are known for breeding. They're not just animals to us. They're family, partners in survival. Thomas nodded, beginning to understand. By midday, they reached the creek White Hawk had mentioned. The water was cool and clear, a blessing in the summer heat. As Buck drank his fill, Thomas checked White Hawk's wound. The bleeding had stopped, but inflammation was setting in. We should stay here until evening, Thomas suggested. Travel when it's cooler. Your arm needs rest. White Hawk agreed, and they made a small camp in the shade of cottonwood trees. As Thomas prepared a fresh poultice for the wound, White Hawk watched him with curious eyes. You are not like other white men I have met, he observed. Thomas shrugged. I'm just trying to make my way, same as anyone. Many would have ridden past yesterday, White Hawk persisted. Or worse. Thomas focused on applying the poultice, uncomfortable with the implied praise. I've been on the receiving end of both kindness and cruelty, he said finally. I prefer to be on the giving end of the former. White Hawk smiled slightly. A simple philosophy, but not an easy one to live by. As the day cooled toward evening, they continued their journey north. The landscape changed gradually, the open plains giving way to more varied terrain, with rolling hills and scattered stands of pine and aspen. White Hawk pointed out landmarks, reading the land as easily as Thomas might read a book. That night, they camped in a small hollow, sheltered from view. As they sat by a small fire, White Hawk shared dried berries and pemmican from his remaining supplies, teaching Thomas the proper way to eat this trail food of the Plains tribes. Tomorrow we will reach Elk River, White Hawk said. From there, it is one more day to my people's camp. Thomas nodded, realizing their time together was growing short. Despite the circumstances, he had come to enjoy White Hawk's company and the glimpses into a way of life so different from his own. What will you do when you return to your people? Thomas asked. Without your horses? White Hawk stared into the fire. I must tell what happened. Perhaps organize a party to track the thieves, though the trail grows cold. He looked up at Thomas. And I must speak of the white man who helped me when others would not. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. That's not necessary. It is our way. White Hawk replied simply. Kindness is remembered. As they settled in for the night, Thomas found himself thinking about the different paths that had brought them to this moment. A failed shopkeeper from St. Louis and a Crow leader, sharing a campfire in the Montana wilderness. There was something about the vastness of the territory that made such unlikely meetings possible, even inevitable. What Thomas couldn't know was that their paths would continue to intertwine in the days ahead, bringing both opportunity and danger as tensions in the territory escalated. The Elk River ran high with late summer snowmelt, its clear waters rushing over smooth stones. Thomas and White Hawk reached it by mid-morning of the third day, their progress slowed by the worsening inflammation in White Hawk's arm. We must cross here, White Hawk said, pointing to a wider, shallower section of the river. My people's summer camp is a half-day's ride on the other side. Thomas eyed the crossing with concern. Your arm is getting worse. The water's cold. It could help with the swelling, but it might be a shock to your system. White Hawk nodded grimly. I have crossed in worse condition. He glanced at Thomas. But I would welcome your support. They forded the river carefully, the water reaching Buck's chest at the deepest point. Thomas kept a steady hand on White Hawk, who had grown noticeably weaker since morning. By the time they reached the far bank, White Hawk was shivering despite the warm day. We need to get you to your people, Thomas said, helping him back onto the horse. You need proper care. They traveled north through a landscape of increasing beauty. Rolling hills covered in summer grasses, stands of aspen whose leaves shimmered in the breeze, and in the distance, the blue outline of mountains. Despite his concern for White Hawk, Thomas couldn't help but be moved by the land's wild majesty. By late afternoon, they spotted smoke from cooking fires rising above a cluster of lodges in a sheltered valley ahead. White Hawk straightened in the saddle, some strength returning at the sight of home. "My people," he said simply. As they approached the camp, Thomas felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon them. Children spotted them first, running ahead to spread the news. By the time they reached the edge of the camp, a group of men had gathered, expressions ranging from concern to suspicion. White Hawk called out in his native language, and the tension visibly eased. Two men rushed forward to help him dismount, supporting him as he explained what had happened. Thomas remained on buck, uncertain of his welcome now that White Hawk was among his own. An older man stepped forward, his long hair streaked with gray, his face deeply lined. He spoke briefly to White Hawk, then turned to Thomas. "I am Running Elk, father of White Hawk," he said in clear English. "My son tells me you helped him when he was wounded and alone." Thomas nodded. "I did what anyone would do." Running Elk's weathered face creased in a slight smile. "No, not anyone. You will stay with us tonight as our guest." Before Thomas could respond, White Hawk was being led away by a woman with herbs and poultices, clearly a healer of the tribe. Running Elk gestured for Thomas to dismount. "Your horse will be cared for," he said. "Gulme, you must be hungry after your journey." Thomas found himself escorted into the heart of the camp, acutely aware of his status as an outsider. Children peeked at him from behind lodge entrances, and women paused in their work to watch him pass. Yet there was no hostility in their gazes, merely curiosity. In Running Elk's lodge, Thomas was given a place of honor and offered a meal of buffalo stew and wild roots. The lodge was spacious and well-appointed, with painted hides decorating the walls and comfortable fur bedding arranged around the central fire. "Your son speaks excellent English," Thomas observed as they ate. Running Elk nodded. "He spent 2 winters at the agency school when he was young. I believe then it was necessary to understand the ways of the white man." His expression darkened slightly. "Now I'm not so certain." "These are complicated times," Thomas offered, unsure what else to say. "Yes," Running Elk agreed. "Complicated." He studied Thomas for a moment. "Why are you in this territory, Thomas Callahan?" The direct question caught Thomas off guard. "I came looking for a new start," he admitted. "I had a business that failed back east. Thought I might find land here, maybe try ranching." Running Elk nodded thoughtfully. "Many come for the land. Land that has been ours since the time of our grandfathers' grandfathers." Thomas felt a flush of discomfort. "I don't mean to take what isn't mine to take." "Yet that is what happens," Running Elk said, though without accusation. "But you helped my son when you could have passed by. That speaks to your character." Later that evening, White Hawk returned to his father's lodge, his arm properly treated and bandaged by the tribe's healer. He looked better already. Some color returned to his face. "The fever is breaking," he told Thomas. "Morning Star is skilled with medicine." As night fell, Thomas was invited to join a council fire where several of the tribe's elders had gathered. There, White Hawk formally recounted the story of the ambush and Thomas's intervention. Thomas understood little of what was said in the Crow language, but he recognized the gravity and ceremony of the occasion. After White Hawk finished speaking, Running Elk addressed the gathering, occasionally gesturing toward Thomas. When he finished, several of the elders nodded in agreement. "What was decided?" Thomas asked White Hawk quietly. "They agree that you have shown yourself to be a true friend," White Hawk explained. "In our way, such friendship must be acknowledged." Thomas wasn't sure what that meant, but he was touched by the sentiment. As the council dispersed, he found himself thinking that he had stumbled into something significant, a connection to this place and these people that he hadn't sought but now valued deeply. What he couldn't know was that the decision made that night would bind him to the fate of White Hawk's people in ways that would test his newfound friendship and force him to choose where his true loyalties lay. Thomas woke before dawn to the sounds of the camp coming to life around him. He had spent the night in a guest lodge, sleeping more soundly than he had in months, despite the unfamiliar surroundings. As he stepped outside, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the distant mountains in soft pinks and purples. A young boy approached, gesturing for Thomas to follow him. The child led him to a cooking fire where several women were preparing the morning meal. Thomas was given a wooden bowl of a porridge-like mixture of grains and berries, along with a cup of strong, dark tea. As he ate, White Hawk joined him, moving more easily than the day before. "The medicine is working," he said, seating himself beside Thomas. "Morning Star says the wound will heal clean if I am careful." "I'm glad to hear it," Thomas replied. "I should probably get on my way to Helena today." White Hawk nodded. "Yes, but first there is a matter to attend to." His expression was solemn, but his eyes held a hint of something Thomas couldn't quite identify. Anticipation, perhaps. After they finished eating, White Hawk led Thomas to the edge of the camp where Running Elk and several other tribal elders were waiting. Beyond them, Thomas could see a small corral made of branches and rawhide rope. Inside were 3 horses, 2 magnificent animals that immediately caught Thomas's attention, and a solid-looking bay mare. The first was a striking black and white painted stallion with powerful hindquarters and an intelligent eye. The second was a spotted mare with a distinctive Appaloosa pattern that White Hawk had described, the prized Nez Perce horse. The third was a sturdy bay, not as flashy as the others, but with good conformation and a calm demeanor. Running Elk stepped forward. "Thomas Callahan, my son has told us how you aided him when he was wounded and alone, how you shared your food, water, and medicine, and brought him safely home when you could have continued on your own path." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "As I said, I only did what?" Running Elk held up a hand, stopping him. "Among our people, such acts of friendship do not go unacknowledged." He gestured to the horses. "Last night, riders from our sister band to the west arrived. They had recovered White Hawk's stolen horses from the thieves, who were found dead, killed in a dispute over their ill-gotten gains." Thomas's eyes widened in surprise. White Hawk's prized horses returned so quickly. It seemed almost too fortunate to believe. "The return of these horses is a good sign," Running Elk continued, "and it allows us to properly thank you for what you have done." He pointed to the bay mare. "This horse is now yours." Thomas stared in shock. A horse was an extremely valuable gift, especially in this territory. I can't accept such a gift," he stammered. "I was just helping a fellow traveler." White Hawk stepped forward. "She is called Quiet Water for her smooth gait," he explained, ignoring Thomas's protest. "She is 4 winters old, trained to both voice and leg commands, and has great endurance. She will serve you well." Thomas looked from White Hawk to Running Elk, realizing that to refuse would be an insult to their generosity and customs. "I am honored," he said finally. "Thank you." Running Elk nodded approvingly. "There is more to discuss." "Cool. The elder led Thomas and White Hawk to his lodge, where they seated themselves around the morning fire. A young woman brought them cups of the strong tea, then discreetly withdrew. "You said you came to this territory seeking land," Running Elk began. "Many whites come for this purpose, and it brings conflict with our people." Thomas nodded, uncertain where this was heading. "But there are places where we might live as neighbors instead of enemies," Running Elk continued. "East of here, half a day's ride, there's a valley. Good water, good grass. It lies near the boundary of our hunting grounds, but is not central to our needs. If you were to settle there, we would consider you a friend on our borders." Thomas was stunned by the offer. Good land with water was the most valuable commodity in the territory, and to be offered such with the blessing of the local tribe was unheard of. "Why would you do this?" he asked bluntly. White Hawk answered, "The settlers come regardless of our wishes. Better to have one we know has a good heart than strangers who might bring trouble." Thomas understood the pragmatic wisdom in this. By establishing him on their borders, they were creating a buffer, someone who might advocate for them when conflicts arose, as they inevitably would. "I would need to see this land," Thomas said cautiously. "Of course," White Hawk replied. "I will show you myself, once we have concluded our business here." Running Elk reached into a small pouch and withdrew something that he handed to Thomas. It was a finely crafted medallion of polished bone, etched with symbols Thomas didn't recognize, hanging from a leather cord. "This marks you as a friend of the Crow," Running Elk explained. If you choose to settle in the valley, where it can be seen when you travel, it will tell our people and those of friendly tribes that you are under our protection." Thomas held the medallion carefully, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with it. "I will honor this token," he said solemnly. After leaving Running Elk's lodge, White Hawk showed Thomas around the camp, introducing him to various members of the tribe. Thomas was struck by the community's organization and self-sufficiency. Women worked at tanning hides and preparing food, men crafted weapons and tools, and children helped with chores while still finding time for play. "Your people seem well established here," Thomas observed. White Hawk's expression turned grave. "For now, but the government agent speaks of moving us again to land that cannot support our ways." He shook his head. "Each year, they push us into smaller spaces, away from the buffalo, away from the places where our ancestors are buried." Thomas had no answer for this hard truth. The westward expansion that had given him a second chance was the same force threatening White Hawk's people's very existence. That afternoon, several young men of the tribe demonstrated horsemanship skills, performing feats of riding that left Thomas in awe. White Hawk explained that many of these skills were essential for buffalo hunting and warfare. "Though the great buffalo herds grow smaller each year," he added sadly, "soon our young men may have no chance to hunt as their fathers did." As the day progressed, Thomas found himself drawn deeper into the life of the camp. He was shown how to properly care for Quiet Water, the mare that was now his, and given supplies for his journey: pemmican, dried berries, and a water skin of superior craftsmanship. By evening, Thomas realized he had made his decision. He would look at the valley White Hawk had described. If it was as promised, he would settle there, becoming a bridge between two worlds that were colliding with increasing force. What he couldn't know was that this decision would soon place him squarely in the path of escalating tensions, as soldiers, settlers, and tribes all sought to control the future of the Montana Territory. His friendship with White Hawk and his people would be tested in fire, forcing him to decide what kind of man he truly wanted to be in this harsh but beautiful land. The valley lay cradled between two gentle ridges, a strip of verdant land approximately 3 miles long and 1 mile wide. A clear stream meandered through its center, bordered by cottonwoods and willows. The morning sun cast the eastern slope in golden light as Thomas and White Hawk surveyed it from a rocky outcropping. "What do you think?" White Hawk asked, watching Thomas's expression carefully. Thomas shook his head in wonder. "It's perfect," he admitted. "Better than anything I could have hoped for." The land below had everything a small ranching operation would need: water, good grass, natural boundaries, even some timber on the northern ridge for building. They rode down into the valley, Quiet Water moving smoothly beneath Thomas. He was already growing fond of the mare, impressed by her intelligence and steady temperament. "This creek never runs dry," White Hawk explained as they watered their horses. "Even in the hottest summers. The hunting is good on the ridges, deer, elk sometimes. The valley floor floods briefly in spring, enriching the soil." Thomas dismounted, crouching to examine the soil. Rich, dark, and loamy, ideal for growing a small crop of feed alongside raising cattle. "Why hasn't anyone settled here before?" he asked, the practical side of his nature suspicious of such good fortune. White Hawk's expression turned solemn. "A white family tried 3 summers ago. They did not seek permission or friendship. They shot at our hunters when they passed through." He paused. "There was trouble. They left." Thomas understood the unspoken warning in this story. "And if I settle here, you would be a neighbor, not an intruder," White Hawk replied. "There would be expectations on both sides. You would not block our occasional passage through the valley. We would respect your boundaries and property." They spent the day exploring the valley, with White Hawk pointing out its features: a natural spring near the western ridge, a meadow particularly rich in medicinal plants, a stand of pines perfect for building. Thomas's mind was already working, planning where he would build his cabin, where he would establish pastures. As evening approached, they made camp by the creek. Thomas built a small fire, while White Hawk caught 2 trout with impressive skill. As they ate the fresh fish, Thomas found himself voicing thoughts he'd barely acknowledged to himself. I've been drifting since the war, he admitted, trying businesses that failed, moving west with no clear purpose. But this place, he gestured at the valley around them, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. For the first time in years, I can picture a future. White Hawk nodded. The land speaks to you. That is good. What about your future? Thomas asked. You spoke of the government wanting to move your people. White Hawk's face hardened. They always want us to move. First, they said we could keep our traditional lands if we stayed peaceful. Then they decided those lands were too valuable. Now, they speak of a reservation far from here. He stared into the fire. My father believes we must find ways to adapt without losing ourselves. That is why he sent me to learn English, why he seeks allies like you. Thomas was silent for a moment, considering the weight of responsibility that came with White Hawk's friendship. I'm just one man, he said finally. Sometimes one man in the right place can make a difference, White Hawk replied, especially one who has seen both worlds. The next morning, they parted ways at the eastern end of the valley. Thomas would continue to Helena to file his claim and purchase supplies, while White Hawk returned to his people. When will you return? White Hawk asked. As soon as possible, Thomas replied. Before the first snow, certainly. I'll need to build at least a basic shelter before winter. White Hawk nodded. We will help with that. It is better to face the winter with solid walls. They clasped arms in farewell, a gesture that bridged their different worlds. Thomas touched the bone medallion that now hung around his neck. Thank you for everything. I won't forget what your people have done for me. We are neighbors now, White Hawk said simply. Remember to wear the medallion when you travel. There are other tribes in these lands, not all friendly to whites, but many will recognize the mark of Crow friendship. As Thomas rode toward Helena, leading Buck alongside Quietwater, his mind was full of plans and possibilities. For the first time since leaving St. Louis, he felt a sense of purpose and direction. The valley represented not just land, but a chance to build something meaningful. What he couldn't know was that the peace of the valley would soon be threatened as the simmering tensions between settlers, the military, and the tribes began to boil over. His newfound friendship with White Hawk's people would place him squarely in the middle of conflicts that would force him to take a stand and potentially change the course of many lives in the process. Helena in 1876 was a city in transition. What had begun as a mining camp was rapidly developing into the territory's economic center. Thomas found the streets bustling with activity: miners, merchants, land speculators, and the usual assortment of saloon owners and pleasure seekers that populated western towns. His first order of business was to file a claim on the valley land. At the land office, he was met with raised eyebrows when he described the location. That's mighty close to Crow territory, the clerk warned, peering at Thomas over wire-rimmed spectacles. Been some trouble with Indians in those parts. I have good relations with the local band, Thomas replied carefully, touching the medallion beneath his shirt. He had decided to keep it hidden in town, unsure how his connection to the Crow would be received. The clerk shrugged. Your funeral. He stamped the papers nonetheless. 160 acres under the Homestead Act. You'll need to build a dwelling and work the land for 5 years before you get full title. Thomas's next stop was the general store, where he invested a significant portion of his remaining savings in tools, seeds, and basic supplies. The proprietor, a portly man named Abernathy, was more forthcoming than the land office clerk. Military's been moving through regular these past few weeks, he mentioned as he totaled Thomas's purchases. Word is they're planning to push all the hostiles onto reservations before winter. The Crow aren't hostile, Thomas pointed out. Abernathy shrugged. Army don't always make such fine distinctions, especially not after what happened to Custer's boys back in June. He gave Thomas a shrewd look. You do well to stay clear of Indian affairs, friend. Dangerous times. Thomas merely nodded, but inwardly he was troubled. The defeat of Custer at the Little Bighorn, though it involved the Sioux and Cheyenne rather than the Crow, had heightened tensions throughout the territory. If the Army was planning a sweep of tribal lands, White Hawk's people could be caught in the middle despite their generally peaceful relations with the government. At the livery stable, Thomas purchased a used wagon and 2 oxen to pull it. He loaded his supplies and prepared for the journey back to the valley, planning to make one final stop at the new telegraph office to send word to his sister in St. Louis that he had finally found a place to settle. As he was leaving the telegraph office, a commotion in the street caught his attention. A military patrol was escorting a small group of Native Americans, prisoners by the look of them. Thomas felt a chill when he recognized the distinctive dress of the Crow. Moving closer, he overheard a conversation between two soldiers. "Found them off the agency land," one was saying. "Lieutenant says they're to be held until they learn to stay where they belong. Whole territory's going to be locked down soon enough," the other replied. "Orders coming straight from Washington after what happened to Custer." Thomas stepped back, his mind racing. If the Army was already detaining Crow people found off designated lands, White Hawk's band could be in imminent danger. Their summer camp was well outside any agency boundaries. The responsible course would be to continue to his new land and establish his claim. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he owed White Hawk and his family a warning, at the very least. His decision made, Thomas left Helena the next morning, but instead of heading directly to the valley, he turned north toward the Crow camp. The journey took 3 days, slowed by the wagon and oxen. As he traveled, he noticed increased military activity, patrols on the roads, smoke from camps in the distance. When he finally approached the site where the camp had been, Thomas was alarmed to find it deserted. The lodge circles remained visible in the grass, but the people were gone. Had they already been rounded up, or had they moved on their own? Thomas made camp, uncertain what to do next. As night fell, he kept his fire small, suddenly aware of his vulnerability. He was no longer just a settler heading to his claim, but a man actively seeking out a tribe that the Army wanted contained. He was startled awake before dawn by a hand over his mouth. White Hawk's face materialized out of the darkness, his finger to his lips in a gesture for silence. When Thomas nodded his understanding, White Hawk removed his hand. "You should not have come here," White Hawk whispered, helping Thomas to his feet. "It is dangerous. I heard in Helena that the Army is detaining Crow people found off agency land," Thomas explained quietly. "I came to warn you." White Hawk's expression was grim but grateful. "We already moved the camp. My father sent scouts to Helena who brought similar news." He glanced around nervously. "A patrol passed nearby yesterday. We must not be found together. Where's your family? Your people?" Thomas asked. "Safe for now. Hidden in the high country." White Hawk's voice was tense. "But we cannot stay there long. There's talk of all Crow bands being forced to the agency before winter." Thomas made a quick decision. "My valley. Your people could shelter there while I establish my claim. The Army would have no reason to search a white settler's homestead." White Hawk stared at Thomas for a long moment. "You would risk this? If they found us there?" "You gave me a horse and land when I had neither," Thomas said simply. "Consider it repayment of a debt." After a moment's consideration, White Hawk nodded. "I will speak with my father, but we must move quickly." They agreed to meet in 2 days at the valley. Thomas would establish his camp openly, beginning work on a cabin as any new settler would. White Hawk's band would approach discreetly from the north, using the ridge for cover. Thomas reached the valley the following afternoon and immediately set to work, clearing ground for a small cabin near the creek. He worked with deliberate visibility, wanting any passing patrols to see exactly what they would expect: a lone settler establishing a homestead. On the morning of the 3rd day, White Hawk appeared at Thomas's camp. He looked tired but relieved. "My people are coming," he said. 38 in all, including women and children. They travel without lodges to move faster, bringing only essentials. Thomas nodded. There's a stand of pines on the north ridge with a spring nearby, hidden from the valley floor, but with good visibility. They could camp there temporarily. By nightfall, White Hawk's band had arrived, moving in small groups to avoid detection. Running Elk, looking older than Thomas remembered, clasped his arm in greeting. "You honor the friendship between us," the elder said. "We will not forget this." Thomas helped them establish a camp in the pine grove, which offered natural shelter and a good vantage point over the surrounding area. The women quickly organized cooking fires and sleeping arrangements, while the men established a watch rotation. For the next 2 weeks, An uneasy routine developed. Thomas worked openly on his cabin in the valley, now with the help of several of the younger Crow men who would retreat to the hidden camp if riders approached. The walls of the cabin rose steadily, and Thomas dug a root cellar for storing provisions through the winter. White Hawk and his hunters provided game, while the women gathered late summer berries and roots to supplement the supplies Thomas had brought from Helena. It was a strange partnership, but one that seemed to benefit all involved. Then came the day when a military patrol appeared at the eastern end of the valley. Thomas was working alone on the cabin roof, the Crow helpers having spotted the dust of approaching riders and withdrawn to the hidden camp. Lieutenant James Harrington was young, probably no more than 25, with the stiff bearing of a West Point graduate. He led 4 enlisted men, all looking trail-worn and wary as they approached Thomas's half-built cabin. Afternoon, Thomas called, setting down his hammer and climbing carefully from the roof. "What brings the army to my homestead?" Harrington remained mounted, looking down at Thomas with a mixture of suspicion and authority. "We're patrolling for hostiles in the area. You're rather isolated out here, Mr. Callahan." "Thomas Callahan." Thomas wiped his hands on his trousers and approached the soldiers, careful to appear relaxed and open. "Just filed my claim in Helena a few weeks back, getting settled before winter." The lieutenant's eyes scanned the homestead, the half-built cabin, the wagon, the oxen grazing nearby, and quiet water and buck in a small corral. "You're alone out here?" Thomas nodded. "For now. Hoping to bring my sister and her boy out from St. Louis come spring, if I can get established." One of the soldiers dismounted and moved toward the cabin, peering inside through the open doorway. "Jenkins," Harrington called sharply. "Mind your manners. That's private property." The soldier stepped back, but his eyes continued to rove over the site. Thomas could feel the tension in the air. "We've had reports of Crow off their agency lands," Harrington continued, "possibly hiding in these foothills. Seen any sign of Indians?" Thomas shrugged, maintaining his casual demeanor though his heart was pounding. "Saw some tracks a few days back heading north. Nothing since." He gestured toward the eastern ridge. "Been focused on getting this roof on before the weather turns." Harrington studied him for a moment. "You were in Helena recently?" "That's right. Picked up supplies, filed my claim. Plan to head back in a month or so before the heavy snows. There's talk of requiring all settlers to come into the towns until this Indian business is settled," Harrington said. "Military protection." Thomas frowned. "With respect, Lieutenant, I've got a cabin to finish and land to prepare for spring planting. Can't do that from town." Harrington seemed about to argue when Jenkins called from where he'd wandered toward Thomas's small corral. "Lieutenant, you might want to see this." Thomas felt a chill as Harrington dismounted and strode over to where Jenkins was examining quiet water. The mare stood calmly as the soldier pointed to the distinctive markings and tack that clearly identified her as native bred. "That's an Indian pony," Jenkins said, suspicion heavy in his voice. "Crow by the look of it." Harrington turned to Thomas, his hand moving to rest on his sidearm. "Care to explain that, Mr. Callahan?" Thomas had prepared for this possibility. He reached slowly into his shirt and withdrew the bone medallion, letting it rest visibly on his chest. "Won her in a trade with some Crow I met on my way west," he said evenly. "They gave me this too, marked me as a friend. They've left me alone since." Harrington's eyes narrowed at the medallion. "You're a bit too friendly with the natives for my liking, Callahan. Just try to live peacefully, Lieutenant. I've got no quarrel with the Crow, and so far they've got none with me." For a tense moment, Thomas thought Harrington might order a search of the surrounding area. Instead, the lieutenant gave a curt nod. "We'll be patrolling these parts regularly," he warned. "If you see any Indians, it's your duty to report it immediately. They're to be on the agency lands and nowhere else. Those are the orders from Washington." "Understand," Thomas replied, not quite making it a promise. As the patrol rode away, Thomas remained outwardly calm, but inside, he was shaken. It was only a matter of time before more thorough searches would be conducted. The hidden camp on the ridge wouldn't remain hidden forever. That evening, he met with Running Elk and White Hawk to share what had happened. "They will return," Running Elk said gravely. "And next time, They will search more carefully. We need a better hiding place, Thomas agreed. Somewhere they wouldn't think to look. White Hawk had been quiet, but now he spoke. The root cellar you've been digging, could it be made larger? Thomas considered this. It could, and I could build false walls, hidden spaces. He looked at Running Elk. Not comfortable, but safer than the ridge if they come searching. For the women, children, and elders, Running Elk nodded. The men can scatter into the high country if necessary. Return when it's safe. Over the next week, Thomas and the Crow men worked tirelessly, expanding the root cellar into a series of connected chambers beneath and behind the cabin. They disguised the entrance with carefully placed barrels and built ventilation shafts that emerged camouflaged among rocks behind the structure. It was primitive and cramped, but it could hide over 24 people in an emergency. The rest of White Hawk's band, primarily the younger men, prepared hiding spots in the surrounding hills where they could retreat if needed. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, just until the heightened military activity subsided or until Running Elk could negotiate safe passage to join other Crow bands farther north. But as October turned to November and the first snows dusted the valley, it became clear they would be spending the winter together. The cabin was finally completed, with an added lean-to for storing firewood and tools. Thomas insisted that Running Elk, White Hawk, and 2 elderly tribal members share the cabin with him, while the hidden chambers beneath sheltered the women and children during the coldest nights. It was during these long winter evenings that Thomas's education in Crow ways deepened. Running Elk shared stories of the tribe's history. White Hawk taught him rudiments of their language, and Thomas found himself increasingly drawn into their worldview. In return, Thomas shared his knowledge of reading and writing with several eager young tribal members, using the few books he'd brought west. He also taught practical skills from his time as a merchant, how to calculate fair trades, how to recognize quality goods, knowledge that might help them navigate the changing world around them. Christmas came and went, celebrated quietly with a mixture of Christian and Crow traditions. Thomas had never felt less alone, despite the isolation of their valley as winter gripped the territory. In January, a heavy blizzard isolated them completely for nearly 2 weeks. When it finally cleared, Thomas rode to the nearest trading post for news and supplies. What he heard there troubled him deeply. The military campaign against non-agency Indians had intensified. Several bands had been forcibly relocated, their lodges and possessions burned. There were rumors of skirmishes and casualties on both sides. Most disturbing was news that all Crow were now required to register at the agency by the end of February. Any found outside agency lands after that date would be considered hostile. Thomas returned to the valley with this grim news. Running Elk listened stoically, then retreated to consider their options. That night, he called a council in the cabin. "We cannot remain hidden forever," the elder concluded. "But neither can we surrender ourselves to the agency, where they will take our horses, our weapons, even our children for their schools. There are Crow bands in Canada," White Hawk suggested, "beyond the reach of the American soldiers." Running Elk nodded. "A difficult journey in winter, but perhaps our only choice now." Thomas listened, torn between his duty as an American citizen and his loyalty to these people who had become his friends, his family, in many ways. Finally, he spoke. "I'll help you reach Canada," he said. "I can guide you through the passes I know, help you trade for supplies along the way. My presence might prevent misunderstandings." White Hawk grasped his arm. "You would leave your new home? All you have built here?" Thomas looked around the cabin, at the walls he had raised with their help, at the valley that had promised him a fresh start. "The land will wait," he said simply. Friends cannot. The decision made, they began preparations for the difficult journey north. They would travel light and fast, abandoning the hidden camp and taking only what could be carried on horseback. Thomas would claim to be guiding a sanctioned hunting party if they encountered any patrols. But fate had other plans. 3 days before their planned departure, as an early February thaw softened the snow, Lieutenant Harrington returned, this time with a full detachment of 20 men. Thomas was chopping wood when they rode into the valley. He set down his axe and walked out to meet them, praying that most of the tribe was well hidden in the root cellar chambers and that the few working outside had spotted the patrol in time to disappear. Harrington dismounted, his manner even more formal than before. "Mr. Callahan," he said coldly, "we have information that you're harboring Indians on your property." Thomas kept his expression neutral. "I live alone here, Lieutenant. As you can see," he gestured to the seemingly empty homestead. "Then you won't mind if we search the premises," Harrington replied. Not a question, but a statement. He turned to his men. "Sergeant, take 4 men and check the cabin and outbuildings. The rest of you spread out and search the surrounding area." Thomas knew resistance would only confirm their suspicions. "Of course," he said, forcing a casual tone, "though I'd appreciate if you'd wipe your boots. Took me weeks to get that floor laid proper." As the soldiers dispersed, Thomas felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach. The hidden chambers beneath the cabin might escape notice if the search was cursory, but a thorough inspection would surely reveal them. And if the soldiers found White Hawk's people hiding there? The sergeant and his men entered the cabin while others began searching the lean-to and small stable Thomas had built for the animals. The rest spread out across the valley floor, checking the tree line and rocky outcroppings where someone might hide. Thomas stood rooted in place, watching as Harrington supervised the search, the lieutenant's eyes never leaving him. Minutes stretched painfully as shouts of "clear" came from various locations. Then came a sound that stopped Thomas's heart, a child's cough, quickly muffled from beneath the cabin. The sergeant emerged from the doorway, shaking his head. "Nothing inside, Lieutenant." Harrington frowned, clearly disappointed. "Check again. Every corner." As the sergeant turned to re-enter the cabin, another soldier called out from where he was examining the ground near the root cellar entrance. "Sir, tracks here, partially covered. Fresh ones." Harrington strode over, Thomas following helplessly. The soldier pointed to faint impressions in the mud, small footprints that could only belong to a child. The lieutenant's eyes met Thomas's, triumph and accusation in his gaze. "Sergeant, bring the men back. We found something." As the soldiers gathered, Thomas made a desperate decision. He stepped forward, placing himself between Harrington and the concealed entrance to the hidden chambers. "Lieutenant, before this goes any further, I need to speak with you. Privately." Harrington hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Keep searching," he ordered his men, then followed Thomas a short distance away. "There are women and children down there," Thomas said quietly, once they were out of earshot. "No warriors, no weapons. Just families seeking shelter from the winter." Harrington's face hardened. "You've been harboring hostiles, Callahan. That's a serious offense." "They're not hostile," Thomas insisted. "They're Crow. They've been peaceful. They helped me build this place." He took a breath. "And they saved my life when I first came to this territory." For a moment, Harrington seemed to waver. Then his military bearing reasserted itself. "The orders are clear. All Indians are to be on agency land. No exceptions." "The agency can't support them all," Thomas argued. "There's not enough food, shelter." "That's not my concern," Harrington cut him off. "My orders." He was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the cabin. Both men turned to see White Hawk emerging from the hidden entrance, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Behind him came running Elk and several women with children. "No." Thomas moved to intercept them, but Harrington grabbed his arm. "Stand down, Callahan," the lieutenant ordered. "It's over." White Hawk approached slowly, his eyes on Harrington. "I am White Hawk of the River Crow," he said with dignity. "These are my people. We seek no conflict with you or your soldiers." The soldiers had their rifles trained on the emerging Crow, but held their fire at Harrington's gesture. The lieutenant studied White Hawk, then Running Elk, who came to stand beside his son. "You're all to be escorted to the agency," Harrington announced. "President Grant's orders. All Indians must be on reservation land." Running Elk spoke, his voice steady despite the tension. "We have lived peacefully here through the winter, harming no one. We ask only to continue north to join our relatives." "That's not possible," Harrington replied. "The northern territories are closed to travel." Thomas stepped forward. "Lieutenant, these people have a right to live free." They've committed no crime. Enough. Harrington snapped. They violated government orders. And you, Callahan, have broken the law by harboring them. He turned to his sergeant. Prepare to escort the Indians to Fort Ellis. Mr. Callahan will accompany us as a prisoner. As the soldiers moved to surround them, Thomas saw the defeat in Running Elk's eyes, the tension in White Hawk's posture. Everything they had worked for through the winter was collapsing around them. Then, unexpectedly, Harrington spoke again, his voice lower. Sergeant, secure the prisoners, but treat them with respect. Notafhandling. He glanced at the women and children. Allow them to gather essential belongings. We'll camp here tonight and move out at first light. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small concession to humanity in the midst of an inhumane policy. Thomas caught Harrington's eye and nodded slightly in acknowledgement. That night, as the soldiers established a perimeter around the cabin and the Crow were held under guard, Thomas found himself seated across from Harrington by the main campfire. Why did you do it, Callahan? The lieutenant asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Risk everything for them. Thomas considered the question carefully. When I came west, I had nothing. Was nobody. White Hawk found me, injured from a fight with 2 men who tried to rob him. I helped him, and in return his people helped me, gave me a horse, showed me this valley. He touched the medallion that still hung around his neck. They made me someone again. Harrington was silent for a long moment. The policy comes for Washington, he said finally. They want the Indian problem solved, once and for all. These are people, not problems, Thomas replied quietly, with a way of life that was here long before either of us. A way of life that's ending, Harrington countered. You must see that. Thomas nodded sadly. I see it, but it doesn't have to end in suffering. There could be a middle path. Perhaps, Harrington conceded. But that's for politicians to decide, not soldiers. He stood, signaling the end of their conversation. Get some rest, Callahan. It's a long ride to Fort Ellis. The next morning dawned clear and cold. As the soldiers prepared to move out, Thomas was allowed a few moments with White Hawk and Running Elk. I'm sorry, Thomas said, the words feeling wholly inadequate. This isn't what I wanted for any of us. Running Elk placed a hand on his shoulder. You have been a true friend, Thomas Callahan. The path ahead is difficult, but not ended. White Hawk embraced him briefly. Remember what I told you when we first met? Sometimes one man in the right place can make a difference. Thomas nodded, though he felt powerless in that moment. I won't abandon you, he promised. Whatever happens at Fort Ellis, I'll find a way to help. As they were led away, Thomas under guard as a prisoner, the Crow people as wards of the government, he took one last look at the valley. The cabin stood as a testament to what could have been, a place where different worlds might have coexisted in peace. The journey to Fort Ellis took 3 days. Upon arrival, Thomas was separated from White Hawk's band and placed in the fort's guardhouse to await a hearing on charges of harboring non-agency Indians, an offense that could result in fines or imprisonment. For 2 weeks, he had no news of his friends. Then, unexpectedly, Lieutenant Harrington appeared at his cell one evening. Your hearing is tomorrow, the officer informed him. Colonel Harrison will preside. Thomas nodded. And White Hawk's people, what's happened to them? Harrington hesitated, then said, they've been processed for transfer to the Crow Agency. But there's been a development you should know about. He glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. Running Elk spoke to the colonel, told him how you helped his son when he was injured, how you tried to mediate between our worlds. Thomas waited, uncertain where this was leading. The colonel was impressed, Harrington continued, especially when White Hawk showed him the medallion they gave you. Apparently, it's a symbol of significant honor among the Crow. What are you saying, Lieutenant? I'm saying your charges might be reduced. Harrington straightened his uniform. And there might be a place for someone who understands both sides in this conflict. The next day, Colonel Harrison offered Thomas an unexpected proposition. In lieu of punishment, he could serve as a civilian liaison between the fort and the Crow Agency, helping to smooth relations and translate not just language but cultural differences. We need men who can bridge these worlds, Callahan, the colonel explained. Men the Indians trust and who understand the government's position. Lieutenant Harrington speaks highly of your character, despite your questionable decisions. Thomas thought of White Hawk's words about one man in the right place making a difference. Perhaps this was where he could do the most good, not hiding his friends, but advocating for them within the system that now confined them. "I'll do it," he agreed. "On one condition, I keep my land claim. The valley remains mine, to be used as I see fit." The colonel considered this, then nodded. "Agreed. But no unauthorized Indians on your property, Callahan. That's non-negotiable." "Understood." In the spring of 1877, Thomas took up his new role at the Crow Agency. The conditions were difficult, crowded, with insufficient supplies and rampant illness. But his presence provided some comfort to White Hawk's band and others who had been forced onto the reservation. He worked tirelessly, leveraging his position to secure better rations, medical supplies, and more humane treatment. When he could, he brought news from the outside world and carried messages between separated families. White Hawk, now recognized as an important voice among the agency Crow, worked alongside Thomas to navigate the complex bureaucracy of Indian affairs. Together, they established schools that respected Crow traditions while teaching the skills needed for the changing world, and helped negotiate grazing rights that allowed the tribe to maintain some semblance of their traditional lifestyle. Running Elk did not live to see these improvements bear fruit. The winter of 1877 to 1878 was harsh, and pneumonia claimed many lives at the agency, the elderly chief among them. Thomas stood with White Hawk at the burial, the two men united in grief and in determination to honor Running Elk's vision of adaptation without surrender. In the summer of 1878, Thomas was finally able to return to his valley. The cabin had weathered the seasons well, though it stood empty and silent. As he walked the land that had once promised a new beginning, he felt the weight of all that had changed. A week later, White Hawk arrived with permission from the Indian agent to visit Thomas's homestead, a small victory in their ongoing struggle for dignity and freedom of movement. Together, they rode to the ridge overlooking the valley, where they had first surveyed the land 2 years earlier. "It's still beautiful," White Hawk observed. "Still a good place." Thomas nodded. "I'm thinking of bringing some of the agency children here during summers. A place to remember the old ways, away from the agency schools." White Hawk smiled, the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from him in months. "My father would have approved." As they sat watching the sun set over the valley, Thomas fingered the bone medallion that still hung around his neck. It had begun with a simple act of kindness, bandaging a stranger's arm. That act had led to friendship, to horses gifted in gratitude, to a valley where different worlds briefly coexisted, and finally to a new purpose, helping a proud people navigate a difficult transition. The journey had not been what either of them expected. The path ahead remained uncertain. But in that moment, as the golden light bathed the valley in warmth, Thomas knew that some bonds, like the one between himself and White Hawk, transcended the artificial boundaries drawn on maps and in policy documents. Some friendships, like the land itself, endured. The end.